Well, hello and welcome to our very first LGBTQ PopOn session. And this one is going to be dedicated to the whole world of podcasting, and not just podcasting in general, but really kind of what is the business case and what makes these things work, stand out, and so forth. So we're here with some fantastic podcasters slash panelists and a large group that will also be available to, after they've kind of gone through and talked a little bit about what they're up to, we'll be able to ask questions as well. So anyway, to get us kick started here, first let me go to speaker view. There we go. And then I was going to say, hey, Brad, you want to go ahead and get started? Tell us a little bit about yourself and also, what kind of sets you apart there.
Sure. So I'm Brad Furr, and you can see by where am I? That wherever that is in the background. I'm in Palm Springs, California, and I own and run GayDesertGuy.com. And after we started a radio project a couple of years ago, K-Gay Radio, I left that project, and the morning team and I decided that we still wanted to have a voice about what's happening in Greater Palm Springs. So we formed the ILoveGay Palm Springs podcast. Matt and I have worked together for a number of years in the early iterations of the ILoveGay campaigns. So I just thought that a brand extension into the ILoveGay Palm Springs podcast was perfect. It's about the fun and games and all the great stuff happening in Palm Springs. However, with the pandemic, we had to pivot into really talking about a lot of issues around health and safety. Is it safe for people to come to Palm Springs? How should our businesses react? What's going on with masks, et cetera? So we've really made a big pivot there. We'll talk a little bit further in a few minutes about how we've made some revenue with the podcast. And my background, I bring a radio background to this. I've been in the radio field since I was a kid and went to college for that, and then worked at Clear Channel Radio, running Pride Radio for a while. And then I ran a project called LGBTQ Radio in Chicago. So that perspective from the broadcast radio side of things is where I come from.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we have some new folks here that I haven't met personally yet, but I have loved engaging with here via email. Darren and Liz from Scissoring Isn't a Thing. Anyway, yeah, how are you guys?
Scissoring isn't a thing. We are here to just dispel that rumor. Liz would disagree with me, but yes, we are the co-hosts of Scissoring Isn't a Thing. Nice to meet you. I am Darren. Liz
Hi.
is the gorgeous looking one right there. Just a little bit about myself. I co-host this with Liz for the past year or so. I actually do another podcast, which is true crime related. So I'm a little bit of I've done a bunch of podcasts in the podcasting world. Our podcast is really structured on sort of leaning into stereotypes and also breaking them down, because especially as a gay woman, the things that I get asked by predominantly cis heterosexual men are quite hilarious. And so Liz and I decided to create a podcast about it and just dispel or maybe lean into any of the rumors. Alexander is actually a guest. He was a guest a few weeks ago. But my background is really in television. I've been Andy Cohen's assistant at Bravo for the past 10 years. So that's kind of how I got my start right out of college. So I am literally a professional gay, which is pretty great. I get to work for the gayest guy and be gay and open, and it's wonderful. And I absolutely love it. And I do host a reality check show on People TV 4 days a week. And so I do that, and I get to talk to all reality stars, and I get to co-host with Liz every single week. Go ahead, Liz.
Darren, thank you for the tee up, because it's 8 a.m. here. I'm begging my wife to make me a cappuccino. I don't know how my beat looks this morning. It's okay. I'm Liz Cully. Darren, thank you for teeing up the podcast. It's a lot of fun. We've been doing it for about a year. I am one of those, you would say, entertainment digital nomads. I've worked at every place under the sun from a production, but also from a business perspective. MySpace, if you guys remember that back in the day, Pop Sugar, Refinery 29, Vice Media Group, and now I run West Coast sales at Bustle Digital Group, which is a collection of magazines, everything from W Magazine to the Zoe Report, and our namesake Bustle. So I kind of work in all different fields of entertainment, hosted a ton of things like the X Games in the past, but I'm so happy and I feel so fortunate that I get to have a ton of fun with Darren every week, talking about a bunch of gay stuff. So it's great.
I love it. Now I see why you guys also connected with Alexander, because you guys, I think you match his energy.
I don't know. Maybe Darren. Darren's always high octane.
It's 11 a.m. here. Come on. I get 3 hours more energy than Liz. So it's 8 a.m. I wouldn't.
And I take that as a compliment because Alexander has the best energy of anyone I've 100%. Ever met.
even at 8 a.m. Alexander, how are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Whoops.
There we go. Well, yes. How many people wish I was muted?
Do you need my wife to bring you a cappuccino too? We're just down the street. Oh, you've got one. Okay, good.
There we go. Maybe a little bit Bailey's in here. I don't know. But I've been a podcaster for 6 years, and I've been a professional podcaster, meaning making money for about 4 years. I left a long-time career in the finance world. That's actually where I met Brad, Matt, and even Fabrice. I was a commercial banker. I did large commercial loans. I represented nonprofits. I was a vice president with the entertainment division of City National Bank for 6 years. And I got into podcasting by talking too much at a Hollywood party. And this woman had just bought a brand new podcast station. And we're talking, 6 years ago. So it wasn't what podcasting is now. And she said, you should have a show. And I said, oh, who, me? And so I went in for a few practice episodes. And here we are years later. And I've been able to leverage the podcast to leave the finance world. I do podcasting 100% of my time, which has led to gigs as an MC for a number of events around the nation. And I'm a lead writer for 2 large magazines. And that's because of my voice from the podcast. Just type it down. Pretty sassy still, even in letter form. And I also have been asked to host 2 other podcasts. So I'm currently hosting 3 concurrent podcasts. And that's how I've grown. And I've learned a lot about marketing, sponsorships, and how to grow your brand and how to reach beyond the LGBT market as well. So I've learned the hard way. So I'm here to share some of my secrets, not my skin secrets. Those are secrets.
But just imagine, you're doing all this the others you've described, and yet none of that would have happened if you hadn't just kind of taken that leap and thrown yourself out there.
That's exactly it. And we know during COVID, we've had to kind of relearn the current the skills that we thought we had. And then we have had to learn a whole new set of skills. And thank God for the podcast and the branding, because those opportunities opened up and, I still have a roof over my head. So I feel very blessed. And I want to inspire other podcasters who might be in a slump or who need kind of that extra boost to really grow and start monetizing from all of the hard work. We know podcasting is hard work. It's everyday work. You go to bed thinking about it. You wake up thinking about it. It's not just plugging in a microphone into your computer in your mom's basement. I'm not in my mom's basement, by the way. But there's so much to it. So it's not just talking into a microphone. And I think a lot of people that get into the business, everybody's told you should have a podcast. Well, not everybody should have a podcast, but if you do, here are the steps and you have to do them. Otherwise, you're going to have 100 listeners for 5 years and that's not going to help anybody.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. And then lastly, Thomas Lopez, who we were graciously introduced to each other. We knew each other online through his podcast, but never really connected. And it was Jack Berger over at Outsmart Houston, a publication down there that connected us. And I wanted to do a little shout out and say thank you, Jack.
Yeah, thank you to Jack. Howdy, everybody. Good morning. I'm in Central Time Zone, so it's 10 o'clock. But I'm still trying to get my bearings. But the energy here is really good, so loving what I'm hearing. I'm excited to be here today. Not a podcaster by day. Kind of fell into it 2 years ago when my husband, actually, now husband, wanted to start his podcast. He's a bit younger than I am, so was hip on the podcast thing and wanted to do a true crime one. So I was like, well, do it. But I also was telling him, like, you should do it because there's a ton of true crime podcasts out there. So I said, you should do it with a gay spin, an LGBTQ spin, like talk about LGBTQ murders. Not that that's a fun topic, or talk kiki about some gay stuff, some gay history. And he was like, nah, I'm good with mine. So I said, fine. Actually, my ex, one thing while we eventually broke up, one thing that bonded us was our passion for history, LGBTQ history. So, and we all get along very well. So I called him up and I was like, hey, we go to the bar and talk about boring stuff anyway, while everyone else is watching RuPaul's Drag Race. So why not us two and another friend of ours hop on Friday nights instead of spending a lot of money at the bars, just put some mics in front of us and see what happens. And as Alexander noted, we realized quickly it's a lot more work than just putting some mics in front of you and talking. But I come with the business mind from it. So I was very purposeful, like had a PowerPoint presentation the first day before we recorded. And I said, if we're going to do this every week, we need to be committed. We need to be anchored in a purpose. And so our podcast is called Let's Talk About Gay Stuff, but it's really anchored around talking about LGBTQ history. And none of us are historians, so we put that as a disclaimer on our website, but we are passionate about the subject. So it's been fun since, so we started in June 2019. It's been fun to bring to life some stories of these LGBTQ pioneers and trailblazers that we've forgotten over the years. I mean, we still slap the icon on Madonna and Cher, and while they're great and helped us, many of us, be stronger and feel validated through their music or through their sassy attitudes. We also realize there's a ton of people who've done some great things in politics and TV and sports and all across the spectrum that we kind of forget are true pioneers and icons. So it's been fun to uncover those stories, both the good and the bad. I mean, we've talked about, Eileen Wuornos, who's a serial killer, who's, part of the LGBTQ community. These are things that that I think are important to tell because it affects how people perceive us. And so we've been doing it almost 2 years now. It's been a pleasant surprise. Last year was a first year we kind of started getting sponsors, and that kind of grew for us, which was great. And then we got some press, which was unsolicited, which is always nice because we know it's some work to get on the radars of folks. But part of what we do, in addition to our podcast, we do a daily post about this day in LGBTQ history. So if you're ever interested in kind of those gee whiz facts, our social media account, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all has a daily posting of something from LGBTQ history. Some of it's fun, some of it's sad. All of it is informative, we think. But we have a good time doing it. We still have a glass of wine or two while we're recording. Lots of kiki before we get into the subjects. And recently, we've introduced a few new topics just because we recognize in watching RuPaul's Drag Race, like a lot of times us older queens tend to cling to the Joan Crawfords and the Chers. And you've got a younger generation, some of these folks on RuPaul's Drag Race that are 20, 21, who have no clue about Madonna or Cher or anything like that. Yet they have their own history. Like they are tied to like someone like SpongeBob SquarePants, who I have no idea who is, but that's who their kind of gay icon is. And so they come on and talk about some of that sort of stuff. So it's been cool. It's been, like I said, we've been having a lot of fun with it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And so now we'll go back. I'll go back to Brad. So Brad, tell me, because you're and what's interesting to point out is that with Brad, he has been running, for lack of a better term, a multimedia empire in Palm Springs. But it's focused on so much print and online advertising, social media, video. And so you've got a different perspective when you're working with clients in terms of, when they're usually trying to figure out how to make outreach to the Palm Springs LGBT community. But now with this podcast, tell us a little bit about the business model there.
So, I came from a company called MS Interactive. MS Communications owned magazines like Los Angeles Magazine. In Chicago, I worked at Q101 back in 2001 when the CEO of our company was asking us in the digital department, this new digital department, is this a hobby or a business? And we quickly determined that it was a business. And what we created back then was ways to engage the audience, the radio audience, to bring them from the radio station over to a website that typically radio station websites had been, the playlist and pictures of the air personalities. We started doing things like Hot or Not, where you'd go and vote on whether this person was hot or not. We did the Best of Late Night with Wendy's, and they sponsored this whole thing because Wendy's was opening up late night. So the whole engagement platform is kind of where I got the whole multimedia platform came from that experience. Also working with print, and I brought that to bear here in Palm Springs. And so when I look at something like a podcast, it's an extension of what we're doing with Gay Desert Guide. It also brings in some unique pieces in being able to do a little more long form interviews with newsmakers. We bring in, because we have like the International Film Festival here. Harry Styles was filming in my development a couple of weeks ago for a movie. We have a lot of things happening here, and so we're able to pivot and do a lot of different subjects with our podcast. And then to monetize that, we have to look at not only a local audience, so going after local advertisers, but now we're trying to look a little broader and go more regional and national. And I'll talk a little bit further about something we're doing with the Bureau of Tourism a little later.
Oh, fantastic. And Darren and Liz, tell us a little bit about the business model you have there, especially when it comes to sponsorships and so forth.
Yeah, Darren, I can speak to this because similar to Brad, I kind of do this in my day life as well, right? So for us, I think what separates us a little bit from the pack is, Darren brings so much expertise in hosting, in particular in podcasts. She's had so much success with Martinis and Murders. I, again, as I mentioned, have kind of like touched a lot of different points, but my day job is really spent strategizing for very large companies how to reach new audiences. And so I think, as we start to gain, because we're still babies, we're 1 year old, we're only 1 year old, 1 year old. As we start to attract new advertisers, the way we've been having to think about things is really the brand first and how we sell the brand. I think what's great about us is we have the opportunity to have incredibly large talent, both that are queer and not. So we get the attraction from advertisers, but then we're kind of placed into the box of some pretty large podcasts like Seth Rogen, et cetera. So we're placed on these celebrity platforms, but we're still growing. So when we think about packaging and creating for advertisers, it's really about the brand first. And that's why Darren and I spent an incredible amount of time, as Alexander kind of touched on marketing and branding. Same thing with Thomas. It's like brand first. So that's kind of how we're really strategizing for right now, but then also looking towards the future.
And just to piggyback off of what Liz said, at least for me, and I do a true crime podcast called Martinis and Murder, which obviously lends itself to a lot of like drinking advertisements, things like that. Like yes, it's the brand, but it also, at least for Liz and I, and certainly for my other podcast, it has to be authentic to us. Like I don't want an advertiser on my podcast or the product that I don't use, or at least have tried out, or in some sort of way that I don't believe in, just because listen, I mean, especially with podcasts, it's really easy to hit that 15-second jump. And that's sort of what we've sort of noticed is people aren't listening to ads. So for us, it's also, how do we make that kind of woven into our content and really fun and really, snackable and digestible for the audience that's listening, as opposed to just hitting that 15-second skip. Sometimes that's a liquor brand. Liz and I have talked about CBD. We've talked about sex toys, things that we can actually have a conversation about. Helps not only get in advertisers because we're making it an authentic experience, but also helps us actually pitch those products to our listeners. So it has to be authentic to Liz and I for sure, first and foremost.
Yeah.
And actually to piggyback on that, something that we actually just worked on last week, I think it's a perfect example, Darren, to talk about how people are skipping through those pre-rolls because they just are. Anchor.com, all these large companies, Wix, et cetera, they go and they just buy across the whole,
Exactly.
Networks, if they go and work with particular networks with tons of podcasts. But what we've actually been trying to do is look at the format of our show and see if there's ownable moments for brands that are more authentic. So, when we talk about travel, we've got a section in the top 10 minutes of the show called The Q, where we kind of talk about queer happenings, maybe we'll talk about an ally. Right. Exactly. fun pop culture, etc. But like thinking about how we could potentially package that up for a travel advertiser where we specifically talk about gay friendly, restaurants,
places to travel,
etc. So we're trying to get as creative as we can within the format of the show to provide advertisers a kind of a more of a premium opportunity. And then outside of that, it's also with custom content as well on our social media channels.
Yeah.
Right.
What is the, I was just going to say, what is the typical format that, is it, for those that don't know, is it a 15 to 30 second, very similar to a commercial, a radio commercial ad?
Yeah, I mean, I've done 15-second ones, 30-second ones, and then minute pre-rolls. And usually before I've like written my own script for it just to make it as authentic and in my voice as possible. Because again, once you hear that tone change and Liz and I are talking about scissoring, and then it's like, and now let me talk to you about this shampoo. Like no one's gonna listen. They can sense the tone change. So I try and weave it in naturally in conversation, but that also comes in writing in my own voice. And same with Liz. Liz will write in her voice and my voice, and we switch it up, and we do like 5 takes sometimes just to make it the most natural conversational type of thing that we possibly can, because no one wants to feel like we're selling you something. That's not fun in a podcast to listen to, even though it's an important thing, because podcasts are so intimate. They're right in your ear. It's not like radio in that way. So they become our friends, and we don't want to feel very like corporate and shilly, but we want people to understand the products that we're using are authentic to us,
which is so important in today's environment. So that's fantastic. And Brad, you had some input?
Yeah, I did. We're doing something for the Palm Springs Bureau of Tourism that it's a little longer form, and it's the first time I've tried this before. But the Bureau of Tourism and their agency came up with a We Are Palm Springs campaign because of the travel restrictions and everything else. They took local merchants and are trying to appeal to locals to support those merchants. And so they've created these videos that are about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So we incorporate that video into our podcast, and then we actually interview that particular business owner who happens to be typically LGBTQ. We do about 2.5, 3 minutes with them just about what's going on in the community, and so it becomes a 5-minute paid segment. It's become our most profitable segment, and it really is weaved so much into the fabric of the I Love Gay Palm Springs podcast that you don't really think of it as commercial.
Yeah, which is so important, and especially for destination marketing, because they're all trying to figure out, how do I keep myself relevant out there when travel is almost non-existent? And that's a great example of the tourism market trying to be creative during a time when they have to step back about showing influencers running around Palm Springs saying, look at what a wonderful time I'm having. So thank you. And Alexander, yeah, how about you?
Well, I just want to reiterate what Darren and Liz pointed on. It's so important to integrate the brand first in such a unique way. Even when we're watching, Hulu, if we're not paying for premium Hulu, and we're fast forwarding those commercials, and we're just not even paying attention anymore. We've conditioned ourselves to ignore ad talk because it's boring and it doesn't really speak to us. So what we've done on our show, because of my unique personality, we film like a 30-second little fun commercial. And whether you have a filmed podcast or not, you have an iPhone, you can film a fun 30-second way to integrate. It's in your own voice, write your own script. You can put that on social media. You can put that on Facebook. You can put it on YouTube. You could tweet that out, but it really makes yourself part of a brand, and your listeners will look at that. We've had brands like Gold's Gym, and it's like, I'm a husky Latino. There's a unique way that I can talk about Gold's Gym. It's that it's not just for the gym goer. It's for every, for the everyday person, go to the gym. But then I have like fan clacks, which is like, yeah, girl, that's just like a natural partnership, but really integrate it in a way. And I always move the ad so it's not in the same place in my show all the time, so that listeners, it's like, haha, gotcha. You just heard a commercial. And they're like, I did? Yes. And I want to talk to the small podcasts just starting out, because I learned a lot in my first couple of years in going after sponsors. We think sponsors, and it's such a big task. We think Lexus, Carnival Cruises, all these big name brands. And maybe your podcast isn't quite there. These brands are writing checks at a minimum of $10,000. So if your podcast is not quite there, there's this huge market of small business owners. And especially now during COVID, During COVID, we're taught small business owners just don't have any money and it's just not a good market to go after. And that's not quite true. There's a market of small business owners that need their brand put out there. And we know podcast listening is up. We know viewership is up. And so if you can create maybe a different budget for a small business, and if you're a smaller podcast, this is great because you might not have this huge budget need. Go after it. There's a huge, pond of fish with those small businesses. And in turn, those small businesses will advertise you as much as you advertise them. They'll be like, hey, my homemade candles were featured on this, and they'll reshare everything. And it's really to grow your own podcast brand presence. It used to be, how many clicks does your podcast have? Yes or no? But it's not that anymore. It's what is your social media? How many platforms are you on? And now when you submit your podcast, you can be on iHeart, Spotify, Amazon Prime at the click of a button. So that's not as special anymore. It's listing your podcast on different syndicates. And so LGBTQ, there's a number of platforms that you can reach out and say, hey, I'd love my show to be listed, or hey, can my show stream Facebook Live every week, or some way to integrate. Get your podcast out there on other platforms. And that's the quickest way to grow your own brand, so that when you go to a sponsor, you can say, yes, I'm a podcast, but then I'm also listed on, like Queer BuzzFeed or whatever. There's so many platforms that you can partner with. And another way to grow your brand is reach out to other podcasts that are in your same genre. Be a guest on their show. Ask them to be a guest on your show. Give them free promotion. Retweet them. Repost have that conversation so that your name pops up more and more. And that's going to make a sponsor happy. And that's going to bring you to the next level where you can reach out to the larger sponsors. And you just, it's baby steps. Sponsorship is really about baby steps. Right out of the market, you're not going to get a $10,000 sponsor. But if you can get 500 to 2,000 sponsors, that's a great chunk, and it's a great way to start.
I love that. And in fact, if I was to summarize what you were saying, engagement was key in that sense, that you work with small businesses as potential sponsors who are actually engaged on social media, because they'll probably already understand a bit more about the opportunities you bring to the table. But then also you're flipping that around and also then working and staying engaged with others in your industry that can also do the same thing. So when you have a message about a small business or anything, all of those channels would be engaged back with you and help get the word out.
And also, I said this in my intro, it's helped me like MC live events. Get your name out there separate from the podcast. Reach out to your local Pride and say, hey, I have a podcast, would love to introduce some of your Pride acts this year. And then you start having that conversation. Then you'll start introducing awards and, getting involved with nonprofit events. And it's such a great way to build your personality on top of your podcast. When we log on to Apple Podcasts, we see all these podcasts and it's like, whoa, but it's that personal touch and it's that personal brand behind it that's really going to get you noticed. So, guerrilla marketing, get your name out there, start shaking hands, kissing babies. Well, don't kiss babies because they're gross, but
Guerrilla marketing 4.0.
And COVID.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And,
but even during COVID, we have Zoom. I've been having conversations with people that I would never meet at a networking function. And I'm talking about radio stations in Ohio. I'm talking about queer platforms in Kansas. I would never have gone to meet them. And so it's a unique opportunity that we have. We know everybody is at home saturating content. People are bored watching Hulu and Netflix, so they're listening. I don't know about anybody else, but my website clicks have gone up 300% during COVID, which is something, even if I paid for kind of promotion, that would never have happened. People are at home listening. Now's the time to engage. Now's the time to engage sponsors with these higher numbers.
Yep. Fantastic. And Thomas, you have anything you'd like to add to some of that?
Yeah, to echo Alexander's point in terms of small businesses, that's who we target actually right now, because we're still a growing podcast in terms of our listenership. So we partnered with small businesses. I'm a board member of the Greater Houston LGBT Chamber of Commerce. So if you're looking to work with small businesses, I'd encourage you to reach out to your local LGBT chamber, because that's a good way to connect with LGBTQ businesses, which is really kind of our target market for sponsors, because we have LGBTQ listeners and allied listeners, and they're constantly reaching out to us saying, how can I support the community, or how can I get involved? And so when we have LGBTQ owned businesses as sponsors, there's a connection there, right? So we're to Darren and Liz's point about authenticity, we can really get behind the product that we're selling or we're promoting on our podcast. The other thing we do with those ads is we sell 3 segments. Because we have topics and we have kind of 3 segments so that it fits nicely into our format. So that's kind of how our podcast is structured. So we can sell them at the front, in the middle, and the end. And depending on where they're placed, that price structure is set up. But again, it's what we do with those sponsors is I just had a conversation with one yesterday. We invited a guest onto our podcast that we interviewed last night, who's wrote a book about gay history in 50 states. One of the things that they're doing is donating books. You can purchase a book and donate it to a nonprofit. So I reached out to my sponsor and I said, hey, we're going to announce that we want to purchase X dollars in books. Like, do you want to go in with us and match? So this way their brand gets out there associated with this donation to a nonprofit organization. So we're trying to help them. Again, I come with a business lens versus a podcasting or broadcasting lens to try to figure out how we can make the pie bigger for everybody. So that's really how we strengthen the relationship with our sponsors so that they last. I'll also note just randomly on trying to get your name out on social media. I mean, in terms of retweeting, there's lots of accounts that our LTAG's account follows. So to get retweeted by some big names is always nice. Occasionally I'll listen to a show like Darren's boss, Andy Cohen Live, and I will call up and be like, hey, I have this, asking for advice, and may drop the name, let's talk about gay stuff. And I may have had a friend or two call me up, were you on Andy Cohen's show? Like, I wasn't on his show, but did I call in? Yes. And there's a couple of other accounts that we follow, radio shows that we follow that will retweet us. And again, anytime they're mentioning on air, let's talk about gay stuff, you kind of see our followers increase on social media, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Now, I'll start with you, but kind of put this out there for whoever wants to jump in after. It's just, are there other business models, or I would even just say revenue streams other than just sponsorship? I know I've seen some that have various membership levels or Patreons and different ways to be able to kind of, in some ways, offer more unique content to like a VIP list and so forth. But do you guys touch on any of that?
I can touch on at least the Patreon aspect of it because I've done this before. We set up like certain tiers. So maybe it's like, you pay $2 a month. Okay, you get an extra episode, or you can get a shout out on the podcast, or you get some merch. Like, there are ways to kind of expand this. I mean, the good thing about podcasts is like, podcasts go on tour and they are the rock stars and, concert going people. Like, they're going to podcasts. I've done a number of live shows, and that's another way to kind of not only get revenue, but to also like, hey, come on, like, it's a comedy show for pretty cheap and you get to go and be boozy for 45 minutes. I mean, it's kind of a low commitment, high fun type of environment. But certainly with Patreon and things like this, there are tiers of things. Sometimes it's a full bonus episode. For me and Martinis and Murder, sometimes if they paid enough, they could come and actually have a martini with us in the office if they were 21 and older and be part of the show. Liz and I haven't done this yet, but we've sort of incorporated this into our bigger episodes, is that for Martinis and Murder, we had a full episode, which was just a case that we were talking about. And then we would offer our audience what we call the secondary episode called Another Shot, where we take a shot, talk about like what Liz and I do in the queue. We talk about our lives. We get this. We can talk about the products that we're using. And that was another tier that people could actually pay for. So there's really creative ways to kind of get alternate revenue as opposed to just putting out a full episode.
Yeah. Anyone else?
The other thing that I've been threatening Darren with, which I'll put on this podcast or on this show, just so she knows that it's serious, is that there's a lot of virtual shows too and virtual lives. So Darren and I are both co-hosts on another show separately, the Taylor Strucker Show, which is a daily paid for show hosted by the one and only Taylor Strucker. And she, in the beginning of the pandemic, was doing these really interesting they're called on location lives, where they're effectively meet and greets that are paid for. She was donating those proceeds to different charities. And very similar to this, like it's kind of an intimate Zoom environment for listeners, which have become incredibly popular. So Darren, I'm making you do it. So just get excited for that. That'll be in your inbox this afternoon. But there's a huge appetite for that. And I think we saw specifically that Pride kind of went away last year. People still wanted that eventized experience. And so it'll be interesting this year with Pride and what that looks like. But it's definitely something that I think continues to thrive during this time.
Yeah. And it looks like we have a few listener questions here. What I was going to actually ask, rather than have me read it, I was going to ask David Perry for one. David, if you wanted to go ahead and unmute and then ask your question, especially the one about the never do's and
Hello,
always
everyone.
do's.
I'm talking to you from the outdoor gym parking lot next to the Palm Springs Airport. It is just the best place to be. So I'm skipping my workout this morning for you. So it's your fault, Matt. So my question is, I have an online show, Video Ahoy, based on 10 years of doing a gay TV show, but I've never done a podcast. How do you begin to monetize a podcast? And when did each of you start making any money from it?
Who wants to start?
God, I mean, you know, Liz and I are still in that early phase, at least with scissoring isn't a thing, where it's like we're kind of now like hitting even on like the resources we've put in as to what we're getting out. Martinis and Murder, I've done that for 4 years. That probably took 2 to 2.5 years to see any real revenue, because the thing about podcasts is that unlike television, which I have the most experience in, and Alexander kind of touched on this a little bit. It's like, it's more of a friendly environment. Like you're not really competing. You can listen to 900 true crime podcasts. You can listen to 9,000 gay podcasts, as opposed to maybe like appointment viewing on television. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about podcasts. Unless it's a, you know, current events type of show, they're evergreen. You can literally go back and listen to a crime that happened in 1960 tomorrow or in a year from now, and all the facts will still remain the same. And so for us, it took a while for us to get some sort of revenue stream, because we were really building our audience. And in order to see any type of real returns, you have to wait until you get to a certain tier. Usually it's like 30 to 50,000 downloads per episode to see any real monetary gain from this. And of course, widespread. Liz and I are just about to get there now, but it definitely takes more time than you'd think it takes, just because there's a lot of podcasts out there, and, you know, listenership can be a little bit spread thin. So it's about like kind of making your mark and sticking with it, because the thing about podcasts is consistency. Every Tuesday, they can expect a Scissoring Isn't a Thing episode. Every Thursday, our audience expects a Martinis and Murder episode. That tells other people to do that. So it does take a little bit of time. You're not going to see returns unless you're insane in like a year, at least, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I want to piggyback on that. It did take me about 2 years. And here's what you need when you reach out to sponsors. You need your analytics. So platforms like Chartable, which you can see kind of the podcast charts. You can sign up through Apple Podcasts. You can sign up for Megaphone at megaphone.fm, and it gives you your analytics that you can give to a potential sponsor, and even for yourself to understand who your demographics are, how many clicks you're getting. But there's a lot of ways to get that, but you need that information. And your social media numbers, you need to build that, and you need a sponsorship kit, even if it's a one sheet about what your show is, who your demographics are, and what you charge. These are the to-do lists. And so it does take time to do that. And through Apple Podcasts, there's a way, if you have an upcoming episode that, let's say, features 3 RuPaul drag queens, so you can let them know, you can let Apple know, hey, I'd like to be a featured podcast. And that's a quick way to jump your placement up on the charts, is write about how you're going to advertise this episode, why this episode should stick out, and coincide it with something like, let's say there's a new season of Drag Race and you happen to have 3 queens that are alumni. Say, like On the Rocks podcast celebrates the premiere of season 14 with Drag Race alumni. That's something that they're going to feature and sponsor. And Spotify also has the same kind of feature, but it takes time to build those analytics, but you need to get reporting, even for yourself, like I said, to understand what your peak times are, where people are listening to, what episodes people are responding to. Also, a quick way to grow your brand to build those numbers is, we're all LGBTQ focused, but reaching beyond that. So, I'm a gay host. but I interview celebrities from the gay world and beyond. You know, I'll have a WWF, wrestler on. I'll have a Playboy model on. I'll have a whole variety of people, and that builds your name and recognition to other audiences, also to other brands that might want to get into advertising. This is also true, and I know there was a comment in the room. This is also true for reaching other minority groups. We know that minority equality is a hot topic right now, and brands are reaching out to minority groups to advertise for spending money. LGBT, Black communities, the Latin communities. So think about that when you're booking your guest or the topics that you're covering. What is trending, and talk about that so that it shows up in Google searches. Great way to build up your analytics. But unless you have about 5,000 clicks, per episode, that take that time and put that energy into building those numbers before you put that energy into reaching out for sponsors.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Matt, I would say remember there's kind of three buckets of where revenue is going to come from. The direct response advertisers, those that buy now, it's the buy the CBD oil, whatever the case may be. There's branded content, which we've talked a lot today. And then just brand awareness. Somebody just may want to be associated with your brand, and they want brand awareness for themselves. So think of it in those three buckets, and then maybe create separate packages or separate programs that can address each of those challenges to a marketer. And then you've got, depending on what that marketer wants, you've got three different pieces to your media kit that can address that.
Thank you. And Richard Morales, you had a really good question. It was longer than I could try to read it if you'd prefer, but if you wouldn't mind coming on and just asking that direct, that'd be great.
Hi, I can just read it, but I mean, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit. To everyone in the room, my name is Richard Morales. I'm the manager of community partnerships at the LGBT Community Center here in New York, where it's currently 11:43 a.m. My question is, I worked previously at El Museo del Barrio, which is a museum in East Harlem that focuses on Latin American and Caribbean art. And I worked in the public program sector there. And at the center, I work with arts and culture programming. And what I tend to see is that, oftentimes like we're all vying for the same pot of money, like that's just the reality of it. And then oftentimes that certain voices or individuals are more open to getting those sources of funding. And in this case, we're talking a lot about marketing and branding and podcast identity, which makes total sense with regards to getting sponsorship and all that we've been discussing here. But I do feel like oftentimes that there's certain voices that are more marketable than others, right? And even just looking around, there's a reason why the hashtag podcast so white exists, is because, it's predominantly dominated by a specific group of people. And so when you have the majority of like buying for these same pots that we're talking about, I think oftentimes like these communities of color get overlooked, or it makes it a little bit challenging. So I'm just curious to hear from, individuals that are actually doing podcasts and the conversations you're having with your peers and your colleagues, like what has been talked about with regards to this, and how are people addressing this?
I'm gonna jump in because my last name is Rodriguez. Okay. I totally know what you mean, Richard. I mean, we look at the top podcasters. We have Adam Carolla, we have Joe Rogan. It's a very white man industry. This is kind of echoing what's happening in Hollywood. It's echoing what's happening, in large corporations. But that conversation is changing. We're talking a lot about racial diversity. One of the only positives out of the Trump administration is that race talk is it's boiling and it's heated. And so what I've done, because I'm not afraid to market myself, if there's like a podcast panel, or if there's any type of panel regarding the LGBT community or even podcasting in general, and I see a bunch of white faces, I'll reach out to whoever is producing that and say, hey, how would you like to add a little diversity to the conversation? I'd like to present myself, and here's what I can talk about. And also in terms of getting sponsorship funds, many of the larger businesses are actually developing part of their marketing budget for diversity marketing. So you can actually reach out to a corporation, say, I'd love to talk to whoever handles your diversity marketing department. And if they say, oh, we don't have one, be like, oh, well, then I'd love to talk to your marketing, and really sell it that it's a unique opportunity to reach a growing audience in different racial and minority groups. Also, I'm a Latino, but do I, is my show Latino? No, I'm like a fake Latino. But what I've done, in fact, I have an episode coming up in 2 weeks with the Homo Homie podcast. And I'm sharing the episode where we're switching places halfway during the episode where they're taking over the show. They're one of the fastest growing Latino-based podcasts with a fierce, loyal audience. And we know any type of minority group, their listeners are more loyal than just this blanket kind of audience for like a Joe Rogan. They want their faces and their stories told. So they're going to follow this podcast. And so that's a great way that I'm going to reach to this whole new Latino community that I necessarily wouldn't be talking to. And they're going to get, my entertainment base. And so we're doing this kind of switch up to have a really honest and candid conversation about that. So it's really reaching out and just being blunt. Who handles diversity marketing? Or I would love to add some diversity to your panel or to the conversation.
Richard,
if I could too, because I think that's a great point from Alexander, is just making sure you ask. I think sometimes we're scared to ask. And so as LGBTQ community, as people of color, as women, sometimes we're like, oh, they're not going to like us because we're not Joe Rogan. So always ask. In terms of partnering with diversity groups, I mean, again, I mentioned I'm part of the LGBTQ chamber. One of the things you can do as a business is have an LGBTBE certification, which is like a minority-owned business. And New York City, for example, just announced that they're recognizing that as a similar, like, veterans-owned business, women's-owned business, minority-owned business. So that helps you with those bigger companies because they're like, oh, now I get credit for doing business with you, which is selfish, but nonetheless, it gets us a seat at the table. The other thing is, I would say, much like we do with our podcast in terms of reaching out to small businesses within the LGBTQ community, sometimes supporting our own local small businesses is a way to kind of get some money, at least early dollars, before you go and do the big swing for the Coca-Colas or the Googles or whatnot. So sometimes just starting with these small businesses, because you have a platform to offer them to share their brand with your audience. I mean, even though your podcast may be 100 people, that's 100 people that's consistently listening to you, that's loyal to your brand, and you're going to put that brand in front of that sponsor's brand in front of that audience, and there may be some traction there. So it doesn't always have to be the big swing, which is nice. I mean, we're not all there. We're not all getting 50,000 downloads per episode, but this is a way to build up, and you don't have to go, you don't have to fight for some of those bigger dollars.
Thank you. And, I completely agree that we don't ask, the question I ask myself is the why. I work a lot with artists. I work with commissioning artists for specific performances or exhibits. And, oftentimes I find myself asking a group of 16 performers. They're traditional indigenous dancers, for instance, and I ask them, what's your rate for performance? And they say, well, $250. That's breaking it down into time for rehearsal, studio space, each performer. I'm like, you're basically not making anything for yourself. And while it's great to say, or to give back to the community and say, we give this performance, I also think it's important to support artists, right? And oftentimes I find that as communities of color, we undersell ourselves a bit. And the question I ask myself is the why, which is related to other histories and all that. So I do agree that, the fact that people don't ask, I think it's also important to think of the why that's not being asked too.
One of the things I think, for those events, when you're having those, like working with sponsors to, wave their flag at that's a way to bring in money, not necessarily just paying for their $250, but if you get 3 sponsors paying $100 or, $200 each, now you've made some money, right? And the $200 may not be a big thing for a vodka company, local, brewery, or a local coffee company. Because I've been talking with some local drag queens and saying, you make no money. The bar may give you $50, but what if I go work with Sky Vodka and the local brewery to pay me, $100 each for one performance, all of a sudden now they're at least walking home with some base pay in addition to all their tips, right? So there's a way that you can bring in some money that not just pays their $250 because you're the hosting firm, but if you get some sponsorships to that, that can pay, also put some money in your organization's pocket, but as well as pay those performers their adequate rate.
And also
say,
I just want to say real fast, and Richard,
yeah.
for any, and this is even for LGBTQ, any LGBTQ podcaster, there's so much free information out there to include in your sponsorship kit. And I would say, kind of modify your sponsorship kit and your ask to each sponsor. It takes time, but it's so worth it. Don't just send 10 blanket
I can't agree with you more, Alex.
Right.
I cannot agree with this statement more. You must tailor each and every single sponsorship package. It goes a long way. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but and to that language, I've even gone far as taking a picture of myself with a brand. If it's a brand I'm using every day, I'll snap a cute picture of me with it and be like, this could be you. Those apartment signs that you said you could be home right now. But also there's free financial information to lead with. So Richard, there's analytics as to the loyalty of LGBTQ listeners buying brands from podcasts that they hear, but there's also those same analytics for the Hispanic community, the Black community, as to what their loyalty rates are in terms of they will support brands that they hear from people that are speaking to their community and represent their community. So there's spending trends out there, there's percentages, and it's exciting stuff. We know as members of the LGBTQ community, if Drag Race, says, hey, this is great, I'm gonna be like, okay, I want it. And so we're going to be more loyal than whether they're watching a Hallmark channel and I see a commercial for something, and there are those analytics out there that you can cut and copy those graphs, lead with that sponsorship ask.
Excellent. All right. Well, I wanted to point out we're kind of so we don't start losing too many folks because they're like, this cannot go over an hour. I definitely really appreciate not only everyone's time and their input and being here. What I was going to say is that for many of you, kind of how I post, which means that you're going to be tagged on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook, and so you will be found. And we're going to use clips, smaller clips from a lot of this as well. There's a variety of questions that have come through. What I'm going to do is send everyone that signed up for this and is here, I'm going to send them all an email that through Eventbrite that lets them know, all your social media handles and so forth. I will include your email addresses unless you tell me otherwise. So if you say no, just use social, that's great. But otherwise, later on today, I'll include your emails because some of the folks have some really good questions about cannabis and frequency of episodes and all sorts of good stuff. And it might make for a great way for all of us to start collaborating a little bit more as well. Yeah. So I'll do all that. And then, I'll also be including the first thing will be a YouTube link to all of this, in its entirety. And then we'll do smaller clips after that. So really, most importantly, I really wanted to thank you all for being a part of this very first episode. And we shall see from the excitement here where we go from here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care,
Thank
y'all.
you. Thanks, you guys.